Croeso mawr, boys. Welcome back to the weekly mates email and video. We're on week 15 this week, and we're looking at the last of the judges, an awesome priest, and a properly powerful prophet. We are looking at no less than Samuel. Samuel was an incredible guy in the Old Testament, has 2 books written after him, and he teaches us emphatically what life looks like when we listen to God and listen for his voice. There's a sense in which I love Samuel because what he points us to is a conversational intimacy with God as our guide and as our lead and as our father. So grab your Bibles. This one is a little bit epic, but try to have a skim read over 1 Samuel and chapters 1 to 16. I know, lots of chapters, but just a skim read over them will give you a real sense of context, and then we'll come back and share 2 or 3 things about the amazing man who is or was Samuel. Okay, so we're talking Samuel this week, and as I said in the intro, Samuel was the last of the judges, and he was an awesome priest and prophet. This was a guy of immense power, not personal power, not the power that comes from ego or believing in himself, but as a man who walked with God from the get-go, from day one of his life, right the way through to the moment that he died. Samuel also is one of my favorite Bible characters because what he demonstrates in his life is what happens when we trust God and we listen to God's voice above every other voice. In fact, when we have a conversational intimacy with God. His story starts, the story before he's born starts with his mother, Hannah. Hannah was a godly woman. Hannah loved God with all her heart, but she was, using the biblical word, she was barren. She was without child. And the reality was, this was breaking her heart. And so when they went up to the temple in Jerusalem, she took the opportunity to go into the temple and to prostrate herself before the Lord and plead with him for a child. And she said in that moment, if you give me a child, I will dedicate that child to you and to your service. So right at that moment, we are so aware that when Samuel is born, his life is going to be extraordinary. And that's what we're looking for in each other, isn't it? We're ordinary people, but we're looking to live extraordinary lives. Now, I feel over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of characters where I've said, and they were a flawed character. But with Samuel, that doesn't feel like that's the case. When he's a child, he hears the Lord calling out to him in the night, and he runs to Eli, the priest at the time, believing that Eli is calling to him. And one of the best things Eli does in his entire life is to actually ascertain that actually this is God speaking to Samuel. And it sets the tone that Samuel will hear from God. He will hear the good things for Israel, but he will also hear the stuff that God is looking to warn Israel about. And we see this throughout his life. He's also the guy who anoints and appoints Saul as king of Israel. And even there, Saul is not the most powerful man in Israel. He doesn't really have the character for that himself, and we'll see that next week. But Samuel is the one who hears from God and defines what the king's role in Israel is going to look like, and what the standards are, and how somebody can be a good king who loves the Lord, but also is able to identify when kings are not being what God has called them to be. So right the way through his life, Samuel is this amazing man of God, committed from birth to following God, to loving God with all his heart, to being a judge over the nation, the last judge before Saul became king, and then continuing as an awesome and powerful priest and prophet. One last thing about Samuel is this: he is the very man who anoints and appoints David as the future king of Israel. Remember what we said about King David even just last week. The man who lived for an audience of one. The man who was a man after God's own heart. Yes, flawed, but also very much the man that God had called to be king over Israel. And it was through the conversational intimacy that Samuel had with God that they were able to go through all of Jesse's sons. And the one guy, the one son who was not present, who was not thought of by Jesse and his brothers, David himself, he was able to say to Jesse, have you got any more sons? Yes, we've got one out in the field. Bring him in. And he saw in David a man of fine stature and tone, but essentially the character to match it. All because Samuel listened to God, never doubted his voice, and literally went about his business to bring about the will of God across the nation of Israel. Samuel is a man that the likes of me and you, as we read the Bible, we look at him and we think, wow, what a guy. Can't really find any fault in him, because his eyes were firmly fixed on God and his heart was wholehearted in serving God and absolutely no one else. So guys, have a great week. But over this week, maybe read some more about Samuel. He was an amazing guy, and he is a great example to us of what it looks like to live for the audience of one, to live in conversational intimacy with God, and to never quit, never give up, always trust God for the future. I'll speak to you next week.